Good afternoon. I'm Elizabeth Horner. I'm the Director of Education here at the Michael C. Carlos Museum at Emory. And it is my great pleasure today to bring together two old friends via Zoom, who are both scholars and activists who will be talking to us about coffee in the Islamic world. Abdulrahman Malik is an award-winning journalist, educator, and cultural organizer. He is a lecturer and associate research scholar at the Yale Divinity School and the program coordinator of Yale's Council on Middle East Studies. Abdulrahman also serves as director of the Muslim Leadership Lab, an innovative student leadership program at the Dwight Hall Center of Social Justice at Yale. He also serves as the program manager for Radical Middle Way, a London-based nonprofit organization offering faith-inspired guidance and tools to enable change, combat exclusion and violence, and promote social justice for all. Abdulrahman is also a frequent journalist for BBC Radio, offering contemporary perspectives on spirituality and culture. You may have heard his audio documentary, The Mohammedan Being. Until 2018, he regularly presented for the popular Pause for Thought segment on Radio 2 and Something Understood on Radio 4. In 2020, in conjunction with the Aga Khan Museum in Toronto and Antica Productions, Abdulrahman launched a new podcast whose title, This Being Human, is inspired by the great Sufi mystic poet Rumi, in which he explores the rich kaleidoscope of contemporary Muslim experience and identity through deep, thoughtful conversations with thought leaders in Muslim art, culture, history, and society. We also have with us today Abbas Barzegar. Abbas fell in love with coffee, books, and working for social justice as a student at the University of Colorado Boulder. He earned his PhD in comparative religions here at Emory. With friends and family, Abbas founded Ebrik Coffee Room in the heart of downtown Atlanta as a passion project while he was teaching in the religious studies department at Georgia State. Hoping to recreate the spirit of the original Mediterranean cafe, Ebrik promotes themes of community, comfort, and culture through all of its activities and partnership. And we were thrilled that several years ago, Abbas brought Ebrik here to the Carlos Museum. Since COVID, he has expanded Ebrik to include a roastery and has created a wonderful blend just for the Wondrous Worlds exhibition, and we'll hear more about that later. In addition to running a coffee shop, which he believes is the secret dream of every academic, Abbas also serves as the director of the Horizon Forum, an organization that engages with philanthropy leaders using applied research practices of peer learning, cross-sector dialogue, and academic analysis to ensure best practices. He is a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and maintains research and teaching affiliations with Indiana University's Lilly Family School of Philanthropy, Emory University's Masters in Development Program, George Mason's Ali Viral Ak Center for Global Islamic Studies. He is the co-author of Islamicism, Contested Perspectives on Political Islam, published by Stanford. His work has been supported by the European Union, the British Council, the U.S. Institute of Peace, the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the American Council of Learned Societies. So welcome to both of you. Thanks for coming to talk about something that's near and dear to all our hearts.
Thank you, Elizabeth. It's good to see you.
Abbas, it's great to see you, and thank you as well, Elizabeth. What a wonderful opportunity to be in conversation with both of you, and to be in conversation with my old friend and comrade, Abbas Barzegar. It's a real honor.
Great to see you, man. Thank you for joining us.
So we're going to start with a slide presentation that Abdulrahman is going to do, and Abbas and I will go away and then come back at the end of the talk for conversation and questions. Please put your questions into the Q&A function, and I can feed them live to Abbas and Abdulrahman as we move on in the program. All right.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And if you could hand over the conch, so to speak, for the screen share, I'll get that up in just a second. Thank you so much. All right, here we go. Wonderful. Once again, thank you so much, Elizabeth and Abbas, for this incredible invitation. And I'm so excited about today because I get to be in conversation with Abbas, and I get to talk to him about the Ebrik Coffee Room, which is one of my favorite coffee shops in the entire world. I was in Atlanta several years ago and had the opportunity to visit at that time the downtown location. And you know, coffee shops are just are wondrous worlds in and of themselves, because you know a cafe, you know if a cafe is welcoming, hospitable, warm immediately. It's not something that takes time. You walk into a space and you know that it is what a coffee shop should be, a place of ideas and conversations and community and of warmth and of welcome. And Ebrik Coffee Room is certainly one of those places. I also want to thank the 86 plus people we have online with us today. Thank you so much for joining us. I love the name of this exhibition, Wondrous Worlds, because for me, coffee and its intersection with Islam is not just a wondrous world, but it is wondrous worlds. It represents for me a story of culture, of history, of politics, of intrigue, of craft, and of the artisan. It also represents to me a story of spirituality, and ultimately a story of our civilization itself. This is a beautiful picture of the coffee set that is featured in the Wondrous Worlds exhibition. Its provenance is from before 1928, I believe. It's from Algeria, and it's kind of like, you know, the formal coffee set that would have been used in a home in Algiers, but actually probably in a home anywhere in in the Muslim majority world. Coffee was such an important part, and serving coffee is such an important part of so many Muslim cultures. And each of those cultures has devised and has crafted a way and a tradition in which to do that. They've also crafted, as Abbas, I'm sure will tell us soon, recipes and roasts and ways of preparation that are indicative of indicative uh, of the cultural milieu from which that particular tradition comes. You can taste a coffee from Somalia. You can taste a coffee from Ethiopia. You can taste a coffee from Syria. You can taste a coffee, of course, from Turkey. And we're going to come back to Turkey in a moment. You know, the story goes that coffee comes from Ethiopia. And when I was a young person, my home was a home of chai. It was a home of tea. Tea was what we drank in the morning at breakfast, what we had in the afternoon, what we had at dinner. Tea was so important in our house that all of us 4 children knew that before the dinner was finished, my father would ask, did someone put on the chai? And so we know that as the dinner finished, the chai better be on the stove and better be getting warm and piping hot, because when we move to the living room, when we bring out some biscuits and some baklawa and some Punjabi mithai, that along with that the tea will be served. To this day, my parents, who are in their 70s, you know, when I go home and visit in pre-COVID times, my parents are in Toronto, you know, sometimes at 2 or 3 in the morning, I hear rustling in the kitchen, and there's my dad up at that godly hour preparing chai for my tea for my mom. Tea is the home beverage, but I grew up considering coffee to be the social beverage. Coffee was a special beverage. It's the beverage we had on Sunday coming home from Sunday school at the mosque. We'd stop at Mr. Donut. We'd go inside. We'd sit together. We'd have a coffee and a donut, and we'd talk about life and what had happened that week in the world. And when I grew a little bit older, I learned the story from Starbucks, no less, about Kaldi, the goat herder, who learned the value of coffee because his goats began to chew on these magnificent red berries, and they became very excitable and jumpy. And this is kind of the apocryphal story, the mythology of coffee. Growing up, I really never connected coffee to the place truly where coffee began to be used, brewed, cultivated as a beverage for the masses. And it wasn't until I spent some time in the Muslim world, and in fact, it was in the holy city of Medina, the city of the Prophet, way back in 1990, in the winter of 1998, 99, that I was sitting with a scholar from Egypt, and it was the month of Ramadan, the month of fasting, which is coming up in just over a month for those who practice that tradition within Islam. Um, and the scholar who he is spending a lot of time with, who is Egyptian but had connections to the Yemen, and his own teachers were from the Yemen, brought out this beautiful Yemeni coffee, which he had ground with his own hands and then boiled and then sieved for us and presented to us before the morning prayer. And then he proceeded to recite this prayer. And as he recited the prayer, I asked him, Sheikh, teacher, what are you reciting? He says, I'm reciting the opening chapter of the Quran, but preceding that opening chapter, I'm saying this supplication. And I said, tell me about this supplication. Oh, he says, we have many of these in the Yemen. I said, many of what, Sheikh? He said, we have many prayers for coffee in the Yemen. And I said, prayers for coffee? He said, yes, prayers for coffee. And I said, what do you call this prayer for coffee? And he said, oh, we call this the short opening prayer for coffee. And I said, are there long opening prayers? He says, yes, these prayers can go on for pages. And that piqued my interest. And I went deeper than I'd ever gone before into the history of coffee. When you see this prayer invokes God. It invokes the teachers and the mashayikh of coffee, the sheikhs of coffee, the scholars of coffee. Bunniya, that which comes from the bean or which is browned, it praises the family of the Prophet, both the men and the women amongst them, the saints, both the men and the women amongst them, and the ones who imbibe it. And then it asks God to release us from the difficulties of this world and to complete all of the things that we desire in our hearts in the way of the faith and in the way of the world, and so on and so forth. I said, any culture which dedicates formal supplication to coffee is hiding a bigger story. And of course, there is a bigger story, and it leads us back to the Yemen. One of the early historians of coffee coined this term Marqaha to describe the feeling of sprightliness and the state of mental well-being that one experiences when one has a perfect cup of coffee. Similar, as Abbas will know as a barista and as a coffee shop owner, to the famous God shot that the baristas talk about. This perfectly extracted espresso that when you drink it, it exports you beyond yourself. You lose yourself in the flavor of that beverage. That is marqaha. And that it was so important to early Islamic culture that there were terms that were coined for it. Where does this all go back to? Well, I often say that the origin of coffee is in Ethiopia. All of the vegetal genetics, if we may, tell us that all of the coffee plants go back to Ethiopia. But really, between the 9th and the 14th centuries, coffee made its way across that water, across that Horn of Africa to the Yemen. And in the Yemen is where coffee found its soul. Coffee began to be used by the mystical orders, by the Sufi orders, by the Islamic spiritual disciplines, as a way of gaining energy and caffeinated alertness for the nightly devotions. So it is said that the Sufi sheikhs would first eat the bean, and later on they would brew and boil the coffee fruit. And later on, they would learn to extract the bean and to roast the bean and then to pound the bean and then to boil it with water to extract its frothy goodness. There are many early scholars in the Yemen who are associated with coffee, but where we first get a kind of a sense that coffee is connected to a personality is really in the personality of Ali ibn Umar al-Shadili. This sheikh whose tomb is still in the city of Mocha, the port city of Mocha, which became the launching point for the coffee trade during the Ottoman period. In the city of Mocha, we find the grave and the shrine around Ali ibn Umar al-Shadili. And it's said that Ali ibn Umar al-Shadili used to imbibe coffee, but that in his circle, a circle of Sufi adepts, of dervishes, that they would sit around, and that coffee became ritualized, that it would be roasted over an open fire, crushed, prepared, boiled, and then the cup would be passed around and invocations would be said to God and the Prophet Muhammad would be remembered. Well, any good thing cannot be kept in the circles of the religious. The religious know that. We know that in Christian tradition, everything from the great nata tart of Portugal to all kinds of incredible libations were founded in monasteries but couldn't remain there. Coffee was no different. Coffee found itself now broadly cultivated. I want to turn our attention for the next 45 seconds to the Yemen. Today, we imagine the Yemen as a site of conflict, as a site of incredible tragedy. And indeed, the past many years have seen that nation being buffeted by violence, so much of it caused by external forces. But this is a picture taken by my friend Mukhtar al-Khanshali, the founder of Port of Mocha Coffee and one of the great coffee visionaries, I believe, alive today. This is his view of one of the towns in which coffee is cultivated. Now, I just want you to have a look at that beautiful picture. Yemen, as many of you on this call will know, is the place where multi-story buildings were first popularized. And this is where these incredible structures took place. This is just a village. But in the valley right behind this village, you will find this. There up in the corner, top left-hand corner, you see the city. And below, the beautiful steps and the coffee plantations, which when European explorers first came to the Yemen, said stretched as far as the eye could see, verdant valleys of green with coffee plant after coffee plant, uncountable and innumerable. This is the Yemen that I want us to think about and remember, the Yemen where coffee was first popularly cultivated and where coffee became a social beverage, something that became popular. So popular, in fact, that Yemeni traders, as they went across to across the Muslim world, they found that they would take the coffee with them. And here, I'm gonna give you a few stories that sort of give us a sense of the breadth of coffee and its importance. 1511. In the city of Mecca, the holiest city in Islam, Khair Bey, the Mamluk potentate responsible for that city, and this is just a short time, as you historians in the audience know, before the Ottoman takeover from the Mamluks, where Mecca and the Hijaz would become part of and come under Ottoman control along with the Yemen. In 1511, Khair Bey walks out of the holy mosque in Mecca, where the Kaaba is, and he smells these unusual smells and finds a group of Yemeni traders gathering around a fire, brewing something in a pot and reciting odes in honor of the Prophet Muhammad, upon whom be peace. Well, he got worried. He's like, what are they brewing? Is this an intoxicant? He called the great men, at that time it would have been men, of Mecca together, including scholars, and he says, what is happening? This beverage, and two of the physicians of court were called, they were Persians, and they came and they were asked to bring coffee, and they said, well, this is gahwa, this is coffee, this is something that the Yemeni people drink, and the Khair Bey desperately wanted this to be an intoxicant. He wanted it to be intoxicant for a number of reasons, but basically he wanted to do something that would show that he was a really good and pious leader. Because Mecca also had other problems, including a illicit alcohol trade, which would come up from time to time, and the Bey wasn't really able to control it. So one of the histories tell us that, in fact, the Bey was trying to overcompensate. And so these Persian physicians, knowing that the Bey did not want this beverage to be allowed, decided to really play it up, ham it up. So they had their coffee and they went into this kind of swoon and they fell to the ground. I do not know myself. What is happening? I've lost sense and control. And there the Bey said, my God, this coffee thing, this kahwa, this is haram. This is prohibited. And the scholars, righteously said, yes, Bey, you're absolutely right, it's prohibited. And they signed the fatwa. And that fatwa was rolled up and it was sent to Cairo, where the Mamluk Sultan was. And the Bey wanted to show the Sultan that indeed, look, I had found this terrible new intoxicant and I've nipped it in the bud. No more intoxicant allowed. Well, by the time the fatwa got to the Mamluk Sultan, you can imagine the Mamluk Sultan sort of ripping it up, because by the time it got to Cairo, coffee had already made it to Cairo. Coffee was all being drunk in the alleyways around the great Al-Azhar University, the great Fatimid institution, Al-Azhar University, and the students from the Yemen who were coming to study at the Al-Azhar University were basically brewing coffee in front of their little dorm rooms, in front of their little huts, and encouraging others to drink it as well. Coffee had become popular in Cairo and had been noticed even by the elite. Khair Bey was released from his charge by the Sultan, was sent to Cairo, and was sadly drawn and quartered. The two physicians were also called back to Cairo to pay for their apparent stupidity, and they were killed by highway robbers. And the sheikh who signed the Meccan fatwa against coffee in 1511 met an untimely and early death. I often say that coffee is God's beverage. You mess with coffee, you mess with God. Another great story, early story of coffee, is that many people don't know that one of the first places the coffee was cultivated outside of the Yemen. And during the Ottoman period, it became illegal to export a live coffee plant or bean. So all the beans, when they were brought to Mocha and cities where coffee was being where the coffee was being processed for trade, they would be boiled in vats of hot water in order to destroy their ability to grow again. However, there was a Sufi, Baba Budan, from southern India, who decided to break the law a little bit. He had come to study spirituality in the Yemen, had become addicted to coffee, and said, how can I return to India? The story goes that without this coffee, it is said that he tied 7 seeds to his chest. And he prayed to God that they would not be found. And he took 7 live seeds and he went to India and he planted them. Many of you may not know that coffee was the most popular beverage in the south of India before the British came and imposed tea on the subcontinent. To this day, I have friends who have visited the grave of Baba Budan, there's a shrine around his grave, and there are coffee shops nearby which celebrate him. Brother Baba Budan is the name of a coffee shop in Melbourne, Australia, where I took this picture, and it memorializes this connection. Coffee started to become big business. Why? Because it became an Ottoman obsession. And now we quickly, in the last 3 or 4 minutes that I have, I want to quickly turn our attention to this Ottoman obsession, and particularly the emergence of the coffee house. If Ethiopia, and there's a lot of story in the middle, of course, and one thing it's important to know, and we'll see a map in just a few moments. Colonial powers before the coming of the 1600s had already recognized the importance and potential importance of coffee as a cash crop. If Ethiopia is where coffee has its blessed origins, and Yemen is where coffee finds its soul, connected to the Sufi and spiritual orders of the Islamic tradition in the Yemen, then in Ottoman Turkey, in Istanbul, in old Constantinople, is where coffee becomes an art form. It is the emergence of the coffee house that is the next revolutionary moment in this incredible beverage. If you can imagine, before the coming of the coffee house, where would people gather? At least in the Muslim world, taverns were underground. In the markas, in the marketplace, in the madrasa, in the school, in the masjid, in the places of worship, in one's own diwan or living room. But the coffee house became the diwan, became the living room outside of one's living room, the Ottomans used to say. and what wondrous activity would started to take place. The first cafe that we know of in the Islamic world was founded in Damascus, but quickly spread all over the lands of Islam. This picture from the Ottoman period shows us a kind of a snapshot of what's happening in a coffee shop. Music, a deep discourse on matters spiritual and worldly. Backgammon and chess is being played. Storytellers are telling their stories. And people there at the top are reading their books and are tasting the coffee. And of course, in the right-hand corner, you have the Kavechi Basha, the one who is the pasha, the real commander, to use gendered language, the master of the coffee house, the barista. That Kavechi Basha would have known the secrets of the coffee shop, would have known what people were saying, and each Kavechi Basha became a master of producing coffee and getting the recipe just right. So much so that we know that baristas, Kavechi Bashas, became important in the court of the Sultan himself. They became important members of the state, and sometimes rising to ministers because of their amazing role. The coffee house in birth and development, says Ralph Hattocks, author of Coffee and Coffee Houses, was a very Muslim institution. The coffee house represented hospitality, grace, craft, art. Coffee houses became places where people of multiple classes would have come together. And this is one of the things, when Europeans came to the Islamic world, they found this very strange, that different classes of people would come together. And in some coffee houses, very few, there would also be women, but there's an entire women's history of coffee that is now being uncovered and revealed, and we can certainly talk a little bit about that. As I finish, I want to show you this map. It shows you in a very quick way the way coffee traveled. How the Dutch and the French were very important. It's the Dutch that stole the coffee bean and took it to Amsterdam, and stole the bean and took it to Ceylon, and later to Java. So Indonesia becomes a very important part in the story of coffee. The French take it to places like Vietnam, to Réunion, eventually to Martinique, which brings coffee to Central America and to the Americas. The Portuguese bring it to Brazil. Eventually it goes to as far as places like Hawaii, and now we see coffee develop. I once asked a group when giving a presentation like this, where does coffee come from? Colombia, Italy, and so on. It's because those places became homes of coffee. It is said in 1600 that Pope Clement himself baptized coffee, so the traders in Catholic lands could trade in it. And it was before this called the Mohammedan gruel, or the devil's cup, because it was said that wine was the beautiful sweet elixir of the Christians, and this gruel, bitter coffee, dark and black, and you can see all the associations that come with that, racial and otherwise. Belonged to the Muslims and the heathens, and they called it the devil's drink. And the Pope is said to have said, some say apocryphally, that the devil's drink is so delicious that we should cheat the devil by baptizing it. We know that in the siege of Vienna, coffee was found outside the walls after the Ottomans were routed, and a story emerged of a two-timing spy who took those coffees and started a coffee shop. And of course, in London, it was the Greek Ottoman Pasqua Rosé and his English master who went into business together and started the first cafe. So that today, when you go to London and you see the Turk's Head over pubs, you would know that in fact that this used to be a coffee shop. Coffee became so popular in London. And when I say that coffee became an art form in Ottoman Turkey, it became a lifestyle, a way of life in London. There was a coffee shop in London, they say at the height of coffee's popularity, one coffee shop for every 140 citizens. This is just in the old city of London itself, a coffee shop dedicated, and each coffee shop was dedicated to its own discipline. They became places of literature and of science and of news and of trading. Lloyd's was a coffee shop before it became a place of insurance. The Athenaeum is where philosophy discussed. The great diarist Samuel Pepys would spend his time at coffee shops. The politicians would go to coffee shops. Coffee shops became these spaces which Habermas came to call the first true public square. And no conversation was private in a coffee shop. No conversation could be private because the coffee shop was the great public. And I think this is a perfect opportunity for us to shift gears, Abbas. And I want to bring you and Elizabeth in on it. There's so much more to say. And my apologies for running a little bit over my 20 minutes. This is a picture from Jerusalem, Abbas. I know you'll appreciate this. Probably after the Asr prayer in the old city. And look at how they're making coffee. It could be Yemen. It could be Yemen in 1490. You know what I mean?
Is this from Jerusalem, huh?
It's from Jerusalem. That's my understanding when I was researching this. And look at this. I mean, look at they're literally roasting, pounding, grinding, and serving. And this lovely idea that, you know, these coffee sets, that there's a barista there who's wearing his fez, and everyone knows that's the Kavechi Basha, and they're serving this amazing and beautiful beverage. And
that's wonderful, man.
And you'll remember this from Damascus, Abbas, the storytellers in the coffee shops of Damascus, where one could sit all night and smoke hookah and have beautiful Syrian coffee with spices and listen to the great stories of the past. This is for me the coffee shop. And Abbas, I know this because I've had coffee with you many times. Coffee is just the excuse, isn't it?
Yeah.
As the Turks say, the sweetness in the coffee comes from the company, and the coffee is just it's an excuse. The real purpose of coffee is sohba and good company and friendship. My friend, you have built a coffee shop. You have imagined this incredible history, and you've made it come true. You've made it live. You're doing it now. I want to hear all about that.
No, I'm sure we'll get into it. That was beautiful, Abdulrahman. Thank you so much. That was a beautiful, beautiful history. I know that we've spent a lot of time speaking of these things, but it was wonderful to hear and see it again and participate with you now today. So, Elizabeth, thank you for bringing us together.
My pleasure. I have a couple of questions. I'm wondering if you're going quickly, and there were a couple of things that I just wanted to get you to go back to a little bit.
Sure.
You were talking about how nothing can stay within a religion. And part of that, you said in a previous conversation we had, was, that the Sufis were not monastic. They were engaged in the world, and it was their sort of it was them who created the trade. And I wonder if you could just go back to the map a little bit and spend a little more time with this, explaining the way that coffee comes out of Yemen and the trade routes, because it's because they were such great traders that this took off, right?
It is incredible. So let's have a quick look. I don't know if you can see my cursor on the screen.
Yes.
Okay, great. So here we have Yemen, of course, and through the trade routes, we find that coffee spreads through the Hijaz, into the Levant, into the Holy Land, and then makes its way into into the modern day Iran, Iraq, into right into the Ottoman Empire, and through that into Europe. It's through this Mediterranean trade that coffee arrives in places like Vienna, in Venice, quite early actually. Venice becomes one of the places. I was recently reading that one of the earliest places where coffee is drunk is Venice and Florence, because of this kind of cultural connection that cities like that have. But also then through North Africa. Isn't it, Abbas? We get a coffee culture, of course, in Cairo, but also as it goes up the Red Sea into Alexandria and into what we would call the Maghreb of now, right? It's interesting because it's the Dutch East India Company that really vies for this coffee plant real early, don't they?
Yeah.
They see the potential of it quite early in the story.
Well, if you look at these trade routes, it's not simply coffee, but it's sugar, it's cotton, and it's just about every major consumer commodity that the Portuguese and the Dutch pick up on in the 15th century, in the 16th century. And literally the trade routes that you notice, and it's visible here, that they are replicating Indian Ocean trade routes across the transatlantic space. So what ends up
Oops,
happening is
sorry.
that what ends up happening is that you have a kind of a transference of these commodities in the transatlantic space, but they're really just appropriations of commodities that were used largely across the quote unquote Muslim world. I mean, this is empire and economy, not necessarily anything to do with religion, but the Islamicate or the Muslim civilization at the time.
Mhm.
And so coffee is actually this really underrepresented commodity of the colonial era that a lot of people don't recognize is central to the history of Haiti, the history of Brazil, the history of enslavement. I mean, and so just as much beauty that exists in the history of coffee and humanity, there's also the horrors that came along with the modern world. And so
Absolutely.
amazing piece of it's amazing opportunity for us to think about coffee and justice and coffee and society throughout time, both in the historical period and even today.
Abbas, I'm so happy you mentioned that because it really is. I mean, this is a story of following this colonial trade routes. You know, it's a Jesuit, it's a Jesuit who brings the coffee first from France to Martinique and grows it there. And we know that even the liberation movements in the Haiti were organized on coffee plantations.
Yeah, absolutely. But what's amazing, again, it's such a messy history because it'd be easy to make a kind of a moral history out of this, like the good and the bad and colonialism. But you know that it's the Jesuits today and faith-based actors today are reviving the supply chains in a way to increase quality and social equity and economic empowerment. And there are models across the world. And the Jesuits, especially in southern Mexico and Chiapas, work with some of the most destitute communities. And for decades, they've been ahead of the game. They're exporting high quality coffee to places like Japan, all
Mhm.
through some really kind of lead from behind Jesuit activity. So it's really a beautiful human story.
It is it's an incredible story, and you know it takes us to these amazing places that we now associate so much with coffee. Like I've spent a lot of time in Java. Every region of Java has its own unique coffee varietals, has its own unique coffee culture. It's embedded in that. To this day, Reunion Island coffee, with the small island off the Indian Ocean where the French took and grew coffee, is considered prized coffee because of this incredible because of the incredible soil. It's basically like a volcanic. It's incredible volcanic. And you know what's interesting? I mean, we were talking about this the other day, and you know our mutual friend Mukhtar al-Khanshali, you know, has been doing a lot of interesting research and connecting with researchers who are doing research into coffee varietals. So different types of the coffee Arabica plant, which is the higher quality coffee plant as opposed to the Robusta plant.
And
You
can
know,
you give a little bit of background about who he is in Dave Eggers' book so that people who might not be aware know who he is?
sure. Our mutual friend Abbas and I, Mukhtar al-Khanshali, American-born Yemeni entrepreneur and innovator, became fascinated with coffee in his early 20s, and eventually went back to the Yemen to try and revive the specialist coffee trade and to really work with farmers and estates to kind of raise the game. You know, Yemen coffee. I mean, I think it'd be right to say Abbas has been devastated by poor trading practices and poor farming practices, really brought on by economic exploitation. And particularly, I think the exploitation of Yemen, of Yemeni agriculture by some of the surrounding states.
Absolutely.
And I think that's led to like the decimation of coffee, but also the growing of things like khat, you know, this kind of narcotic plant that's grown, and
Yeah.
people like Mukhtar have gone back and have really risked their lives in many ways, right? And as Dave Eggers' book, which I call The Monk of Mocha, which traces Mukhtar's story, tells us, I mean, literally he risked his life to try and get the quality products, years of work that had happened in the Yemen to an American audience. And the year that Yemeni coffee came to the United States, it was the most expensive coffee in America. It was $16.50 a cup.
And it won the Specialty Coffee Association of the Year's Quality Cup. And so it's a really, really amazing story. And it's a privilege to be, you know, kind of a part of this in whatever way that we are. Elizabeth, I'm sure that your audience members have some, you know, and the folks that are joining us, I can't believe there's 100 people on the call. That's amazing. And so I'm sure there's some folks that would want to ask some questions. And Elizabeth, I'm sure you've got some.
Well, we have some comments. A lot of people are commenting in the chat about the Jesuits and the coffee plantations in Venezuela. You know, I was struck, we were talking the other day, and you guys were talking about the resiliency of the Yemeni plant itself, and how when the blight hit Guatemala, it was the Yemeni plant that was taken in to save the crop, basically. And this sort of, I'd love to hear you talk more about.
Yeah, I mean, this is something Mathar tells us about, and that we know that the Yemeni coffee plants, coming from their Ethiopian source, are incredibly resilient. You had a word for it, Abbas, a technical word where a plant doesn't require a lot of water. You know, it's like this kind of, right? It's kind of, it can last in the most harshest of conditions.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I mean, the Yemeni plant itself has been brought all over the world, and it's actually located, like you said, in amazing different places. You find the Yemeni origin. But the story of the Yemeni coffee, I think, is an important one today because of what's happening. I mean, Elizabeth, you know, we've talked about this a little bit as well. So you've got this resilience in the actual plant itself, but what's amazing, you also have the resilience in the sector itself, the economic sector itself. Yemen is one of these places that has a variety of religious communities, ethnic communities, tribal communities, and political factions. As we've seen, it's subject to a massive geopolitical situation right now that's devastated the country. However, because it's grown across Yemen and because it's this really unique space, every group in Yemen participates in the coffee, in the production of coffee. And you can still find and get access to Yemeni coffee today. And there are many people in the development sector, in the humanitarian sector, that are looking to use coffee. I mean, frankly, like, we are waiting for the political situation to settle itself so that we can explore building the coffee sector in Yemen as a post-conflict stabilization program. People don't realize how important your supply chains are for this. Did you know that in Colombia right now, in former FARC held territories where cocoa plants were the primary, sustaining force for a number, thousands upon thousands of people in certain parts of Colombia, that there are programs now, colleagues of ours, that are growing coffee instead of cocaine, right? And giving farmers a livelihood through coffee. And it's called the Coffee for Peace program. And there are major global political actors behind it to make peace work. I already mentioned Chiapas, how coffee works in that way. In Rwanda, after the genocide, one of the first things folks did, again, faith-based communities went in and invested in coffee as a way of post-conflict reconciliation. So there's tremendous amounts of potential in just thinking through, your choice of coffee. You can get a higher quality coffee, you can get a fresher cup of coffee, and you can literally change a situation of war, of famine, of poverty. So it's a remarkable opportunity.
And Abbas, how does that affect how do your sort of political and social aspirations mesh with your business? How does Ebrik play out in this situation?
Well, thank you for asking. And so, you read in the intro that we really consider Ebrik to be a revival of the original Mediterranean cafe. And by the Mediterranean cafe, I want people to remember that the Middle East, or the Mediterranean, is, the Middle East and the Mediterranean are together, right? The Mediterranean world, the Eastern Mediterranean, is the crucible through which so-called East and West meet with one another. And so the things that folks are seeing in the Wondrous Worlds exhibit today, they happen through that same crucible, right? That's the crucible of civilization, of exchange, and everything like that. So for us, Ebrik has always been is intending to kind of revive that spirit. And the word Ebrik itself, a lot of folks ask me, Abbas, where'd you find that word? I don't know if anybody's seen a Turkish coffee pot before, right? One of the words for this is Ebrik. Okay, Ebrik also kind of means watering pot and whatnot. And so there's different words. But what's beautiful about the word is that folks don't know actually where it's from. We don't know if it's an Arabic word. We don't know if it's a Greek word. Like linguistics don't actually know the etymology, but we do know that it is the place and the thing through which community is formed, whether you're making tea, whether you're making coffee. And so what we did is we decided to name it the Ebrik Coffee Room because we wanted it to feel like people's homes. We wanted it filled, we wanted it a space for community building. So our motto is community, comfort, culture. And when we were founded, we just made sure that we created a space that literally displayed the art of the community around it. So student-led art, community-led art shows. We wanted to make sure that books and art that were being displayed in the show or being spoken or any kind of activity in the store was reflective of the community that we were in, right? And so we did this, and in a very short period of time, we got to a situation where Stacey Abrams and John Lewis would come and stump in the shop. We came to a place where the mayor of Atlanta sits in the shop just for the heck of it, right? City councilmen sit there, but we also have a space where students come in, working class people come in, the houseless amongst us come in, and everybody's treated with dignity and respect. And we feel like that sense of inclusion, really a kind of radical sense of inclusion, parts with a lot of the coffee sector that we see emerging today. Coffee is beautiful. We've talked about the story, and we value the origins of coffee and the quality of coffee, but that doesn't mean that you have to be exclusionary. And I've personally found that a lot of the coffee shops that were emerging around the country, I personally didn't feel comfortable in them. And I've got a PhD and speak a few languages, right? And I didn't feel like I was welcome in this kind of eclectic environment. And so we wanted to make a coffee shop that was inclusive, radically inclusive and representative. But I'll take it one step further in terms of our commitments. Since we went online and since we've really focused now on roasting more and thinking through how we roast and ourselves as a manufacturer, we've always made a point to work with local roasters. We've always made a point to kind of make sure we know where our coffee is coming from. But we've really committed now to something we call the social solidarity supply chain. I know it's a little bit of a mouthful, but the solidarity supply chain, where I only want my coffee to come from places where I know that the people I'm buying from are impacting directly on the ground. So whether I can, as close to the farm as I can get would be great, okay? But sometimes in a place like Ethiopia, you can't get to the farmer directly, right? And if for a coffee business like my size, I can't get there, but I can work with an exporter and a co-op owner that I know is responsible, traceable, and I can identify sort of how our dollar is moving across that chain. But I'm not just interested in fair trade. I'm not just interested in it being organic. And I definitely don't think that, fair trade levels and these kind of like arbitrary levels of price per coffee is going to make a difference. No, I want to know what kind of social programming exists for economic empowerment, for community empowerment around this coffee bean. And so thankfully today, there is a lot of traceability around coffee. And we've just committed to make sure that any coffee that we're buying is kind of responsibly sourced in this way, but participating in the empowerment of people around the world. And on top of that, we only want to sell to people who care about that too. And so if you're not interested in that sort of value, then we don't really, just as like just as in the shop, if people didn't participate in this kind of ethic and value system, then they probably weren't going to feel comfortable in the shop. And if you don't participate and you don't value that and you want a quick cup of coffee for cheaper, that's fine. There's more than enough of that on the market. But we want to make sure that anything that's coming in and out of our shop and anybody that we're partnering with is representative of those values.
So
I just want to raise that for a second, Elizabeth. I want to raise it up even further. There is a really kind of, as Abbas had said, a kind of a horrific side to the coffee trade, right? Fair trade is not enough. If we look, for example, at the unequal trade practices of many large multinationals who buy under the fair trade price, the fair trade price is just maintaining poverty. Actually, let's be honest, for most people, for most coffee producers. So it's not enough for us to be fair trade. And I think the method and the approach that Abbas is talking about is not just exciting, but it is now becoming amongst specialty roasters. And I want to raise up other roasters like Corvus Coffee and particularly Onyx Coffee in the American South, who have this incredibly transparent. You go on their website, and you know this, Abbas. You go on their website, they'll tell you to the penny what they paid the farmer. They'll tell you to the penny what their profit is. They'll tell you to the penny what they're selling it to you for. They'll tell you to the penny what the investment in local community is. It is so it is so important, because this is what I love. When I drink Abbas's coffee, you know, and his Santa Ana blend, when he introduced it, blew my socks off. I dreamt about that coffee, Abbas, and you know, my friends ordered it, and we're like, oh my God, it was just so good. You know, when I'm drinking like Abbas's coffee, and I'm drinking coffee from Port of Mocha or from Onyx or from Corvus, I am literally drinking the blood, sweat, and tears of entire communities. You know, when we speak to our friend Abbas and Mukhtar, and we say, Mukhtar, you know, what does it mean to do direct trade? He says, I'll tell you what it means to do direct trade. It means we built a dozen schools. It means that we put piping in for sewage and water in X number of villages. We facilitated the marriage of this many village members, and we moved people off, just like in Colombia, we moved people off growing narcotics.
Yeah, and
that is the power of coffee.
It really is. And I want to be clear that we're on a journey to get there, and we really are hoping. And so we can only move there as far as our business allows us to, right? And so it's been a tough year with COVID, and it's been a tough kind of transition. But I do want to say that, you know, to echo the great companies that you're talking about, Ebrik is on the way there. I don't want to, you know, and so we have a goal to get to this place of transparency, and there's quite a bit already, but we don't do direct trade yet, right? And so I can only go so far in terms of transparency, in so much as my importer or my, you know, my connection.
It's coming. I know it's coming to Bus. I know we're behind you.
To get there. You know, I don't want it any other way, you know.
Let's go back to this inclusivity. We have two questions in the Q&A about gender. One stating, when I briefly lived in Morocco, coffee houses, especially those beyond the large cities, were viewed as extremely male-dominated spaces. Were there ever time and place in previous centuries where they were more open to people of other gender identities? And then another, Roxanne Margheriti here at Emory, mentions that in Alexander Russell's Natural History of Aleppo, there is an image of elite women enjoying coffee and tobacco at home. Is there a story to be told about gendered consumption of coffee in the Ottoman Empire or anywhere historically, or is the evidence too sparse?
No, I would say actually there's an entire body of work that's emerging, and thank you for that question. You know, in Aleppo, in Istanbul, and elsewhere, that you know, social histories are telling us a lot about the consumption of coffee. And yes, coffee was gendered. So while there was a class element that was being challenged by the coffee shop, the gendered elements of segregated and gendered societies often remained. And that was the case in Europe as well. Although in places like London, it became associated with elite, not elite. And that actually is what brings tea into the equation, because tea became the beverage initially of the elite, and it was drunk at home. One of your the participants here asked about the women's petition against coffee. In fact, women in London organized a petition against coffee because their husbands were not going to get drunk, but they were going to coffee houses and spending the entire night discussing philosophy and art and politics. And the women that would have been there would have been women of lower socioeconomic status. They were the ones who were more welcome in those kinds of spaces. So the women's petition against coffee actually can be seen, I think, Abbas, I think I'd be safe to say, as as a very kind of early, also Islamophobic document, because coffee is associated with the Moor, the Muslim, the Turk. It's actually called in the women's petition on coffee the Turkish vixen. In parodies of coffee, coffee is called the bitter Mohammedan gruel. Yeah. That's what it's called. It's called the bitter Mohammedan gruel. That's why I called my documentary the Mohammedan bean, to lift it from gruel into something else. But there is definitely those elements of it. And the questioner is absolutely right. You know, I think a lot of these spaces in certain parts of the world, and that's in the Muslim world and outside it, these have become male spaces. However, you go to contemporary Istanbul today, there's not one coffee shop that I've been to where I don't see young people of all kinds gathering. And in fact, I mean, I think there's a really interesting queer history of coffee to be told, because coffee shops became places where people could express sexual identities that were non-heteronormative, certainly male non-heteronormative identities within the coffee shop space. And actually, there's some very significant research on that's emerging about the Ottoman coffee shop and the exploration of non-heteronormative of sexualities. So I think this is a really interesting terrain. It's a complicated terrain, but it's also a terrain which talks about evolution, right? That coffee shops evolve into places that are truly inclusive. Abbas, are you going to brew for us?
I am. I don't
You
know.
have to. You have to.
Yes. While he brews, you guys can also answer another question while Abbas is getting the water. Is climate change having an effect on even the most resilient coffee plants?
Abbas, you can best answer that. I would say yes.
Yeah, it sure is. And as much as I, lament what Starbucks has done in some ways to coffee, it's also lifted coffee and coffee research and brought coffee back in some ways away from just kind of a gas station commodity. So Starbucks, from what my understanding is that they're already experimenting to anticipate climate change 20 to 30 years down the road. So they're doing a hybrid model of an Arabica and a Robusta coffee, so that the coffee plant could be a little bit more resilient in the future. So there are moves in that direction.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Experimenting with the ability to do that. But yes, that is something. It is also a water intensive plant, of course, and so there are some concerns about basically how many resources are necessary, especially in a place like Yemen, where water is scarce. Can we justify reviving an industry that depends upon that much water, right? However, as a cash crop and as a cash commodity, places like Ethiopia and Yemen and other countries, even places like Myanmar and others, they're looking to coffee and the global consumption of coffee as a way to literally pay for, it's a cash commodity in order for the country to be able to exchange in other imports. And so for Ethiopia, Ethiopians the country doesn't necessarily make a net profit on coffee, but it gives them access to the global markets and increased reserves to be able to exchange in other ways. And so some really interesting dynamics there. And again, the more that the consumer understands about sort of the multifaceted layers of coffee, the better we are in a position to address some of these major global concerns. I know it sounds like a far-fetched issue to say that we're going to stop conflict and change, and stop climate change because of coffee. But the fact of the matter is that just like any consumer product you use has an entry point for social responsibility, so too can coffee, So let me jump in real quick. Right now, what I'm doing is I'm just going to make a pour over coffee of our special blend. It's actually called Marqaha Moments. And this is a special blend that we made for the Wondrous World exhibit. And again, Elizabeth.
That's so awesome.
All the staff here, thank you so much for giving us this opportunity. And for folks to understand just a little bit, I've got here a picture of the whirling dervish. And this is the emblematic sort of Sufi symbol of ecstasy, of spiritual enlightenment, etc. But Marqaha, again, is that word that Abdurrahman mentioned earlier, that some of the early writers of coffee mentioned in terms of that feeling of euphoria and sprightliness that one gets when you drink coffee. So we made this in honor of the Wondrous Worlds exhibit. It's a limited time offering and whatnot, but many people have heard of mocha java coffee. Like everybody's heard of mocha java coffee. It's like, you hear about this. A lot of people think it's mocha in terms of chocolate. It's not. As we learned today, it's mocha, the port in Yemen with the port Java, right, in Indonesia. And it was really the mixing of these coffee beans through Dutch, Portuguese, and French trade happening and circulating in the Indian Ocean that made its way over into the Mediterranean, whether it went through land via Ottoman trade routes or via sea through Dutch and Portuguese routes. That coffee is the coffee that we drink in the world. So we've made a mocha java blend that mimics that flavor. Now, we didn't put Yemeni coffee in here because access and price, frankly. But what we did is we blended an Ethiopian Yirgacheffe with a Sumatran, and it's about 60-65% Ethiopian, 35%, 40% of the Sumatran blend. And we're just trying to kind of pay homage and honor.
It must be really earthy, because the Sumatran coffees have an incredible earthiness to them. I find like a you know, a kind of a heavy mouthfeel, a kind of an earthy flavor. I don't know if you've ever been to Indonesia, Abbas, but you know, we got to go together, man, because you go from West Java all the way to East Java. Every region now has its own unique varietals, and there's a coffee culture. And I can tell you, you can taste the coffee in West Java, and you can taste the coffee just on the island of Java itself. We're not even going to Sulawesi or Sumatra or you know, the local Achinese blends, but just in Java alone, like I've been blown away by the sophistication of coffee there, and the extent to which coffee is so much part of Javanese culture. And so much of that because Java was deeply influenced by Yemeni Sufis, who came and who are literally descendants, you know, of the very people who were founding coffee. There's this really interesting spiritual connection between Javanese culture, Yemeni culture, and coffee. It's so interesting.
People don't really understand the importance of the Indian trade route, right? And so people don't realize that Islam literally went to Indonesia through Yemen. Right. And it's fascinating story. So what you're seeing me do here, by the way, folks at home, I wanted to just present the method of making coffee here called a pour over coffee. Now, I know everybody's got their Keurigs and their Nespressos, and they're cute and they're nice, and some of them are pretty good. I'm not going to lie. I was regrettably impressed with an espresso that I drank the other day, you know, but
I'm sure that's true of Keurig, though.
Yeah, Keurigs are a little bit harder to pull off, but I would just suggest that if anybody has, if they don't already have a pour over at home, that they invest a little bit of, you know, time and energy in acquiring one of these. And this is a ceramic pour over, and basically it's just a controlled drip method. And so folks, that old drip machine that like is kind of clunky and nobody really wants to mess with anymore, that's actually a really good way to make coffee, because it slowly allows the coffee to be absorbed by water. It all gets saturated at the same time, and it slowly extracts. So the process of oxidization as well as extraction happen at the same time. It's actually a really good way to make coffee. The pour over is simply a controlled method to do that. If you want to get fancy, you can get like a kitchen scale, and you can work with your ratios. I would basically say 20 grams of coffee. About 20 grams of coffee is going to make you about an 8 to 10 ounce cup of coffee. All right, so 20 grams of this, and that's going to translate to something about like 4 teaspoons or 2 big tablespoons, right? And so what we do is you just place this over here. You're going to want to have some boiling hot water. This is called a gooseneck kettle. It actually helps with the process because there's some ways to pour the coffee that kind of help a little bit in the extraction process. Plus, it's a little fun. It's a little artisanal, and there's a little bit of a meditative process. It's nice to focus on something like this first thing in the morning. You know, you dedicate about 5 minutes or so to making that good cup of coffee, and it gets your day off to the right start. And so what we do is, it's hard for me to show you on the screen here, but basically we're going from the center to the periphery in pouring out the coffee. And what we do is we pause for just a moment and we allow the coffee to oxidize. And what we're doing is, it's also called the blooming method. I'm going to risk a little bit here. What you're going to see here, you see all that brown immersion there, that kind of creamy color? That's actually an oxidization process. And if you were to get over-the-counter coffee and try that, you wouldn't get that color because the beans aren't fresh. So literally, it was hard to see here with the camera. If you were here in person, you would see this bloom and blossom like a flower. The beans actually extract, all right, certain gases are released, and it literally opens the door for extraction. So after that stage, then we just pour the coffee, and you sort of fill it up. And again, it's about 8 to 10 ounces of water is going to correspond to about 20 grams of coffee.
And is the purpose of that type of pot because it's just a more narrow spout than a tea kettle, and so it just slows down the process a little bit?
Slows down the process. Also, it doesn't splash the coffee out everywhere. So so if you were to just pour like a bunch of hot water on it, what's going to happen is that your grounds are going to get splashed around, and you're not going to have it's not going to have as even of an extraction. And so this allows you to evenly extract it, also to avoid sort of pouring water all over the filter and things like that. So again, it's just a little bit of an exact. More of
it's control, isn't it, Abbas? Because you want to be able to control the amount of water that's flowing through, and too much water will result in a different sort of extraction, right? And so you want to regulate that to really bring out all these incredible flavors. And one of the things, Abbas, that I learned like really early in my coffee journey is they say that a wine has something like 200 flavonoids or something, right? These kind of chemical reactions that are taking place. Coffee has over 400. So in terms of complexity, we're really looking at a beverage which sits right alongside the best sort of brewed beverages, alcohol and others.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so there's a reason, coffee is kind of the wine of Islam.
Yeah, and actually, I'm glad you bring up the point. One time a barista said this to me very early in my coffee journey. I went to a coffee shop and it was something like a $5 cup of coffee. It was a pour over. And at that time, I thought that was a lot. And he said, it's kind of remarkable that you can drink the very best of something for about $5 to $8, right? If you were to think about it in terms of the extracted cup, the most expensive coffee that you can buy, which sounds outlandish sometimes. Our friend Mukhtar that we're talking about, he can sell his coffee for like $30 for 4 ounces. Okay. Sounds outlandish, but when you break that down into pour overs, that brings you to about a $4 or $5 cup of coffee. Okay. And if you can think about enjoying that coffee for that amount, it's an immense privilege to be able to say that the very best of something is accessible to literally everybody. Right? Like that's still not a prohibitive cost for anybody out there if you wanted to truly enjoy that luxury. So a couple of notes just on extraction. You'll see me here using a paper filter. So most folks are accustomed to paper filters. Remember that if you're using a French press or an espresso, the metal filter does not filter out oils as much. And so you're more inclined and more likely to get a full-bodied kind of thicker mouthfeel, heavier cup of coffee if you are drinking it from a French press or an espresso shot or something of that nature. Again, because paper is going to extract the oils, whereas French presses and espressos are going to keep them in there. You can even find metal pour overs, so you can also play with that. And these are just a couple of different ways to think about playing with your coffee. So whenever we get a new coffee, we brew it or we roast it at a certain level, and then we try it out in these different ways of extraction. And what that does is it gives you a little bit more about the personality of the coffee, and you can kind of get it. Is this my friend Nuri Friedlander on the call? Get out of here.
It is Nuri. I just messaged him on our behalf just to say.
Okay, good.
So great to see him and so many other friends here.
That's wonderful. So I'm going to enjoy this. If you were with me, I'd be making you all a cup of coffee.
You didn't make that for me. I was going to come up and get it.
We'll bring it. I'll make sure yours is.
I can't wait. I can't wait to try Marqaha Moments. It sounds so wonderful. I brewed a Colombian geisha varietal today, and it's a nice one. It was one that Mukhtar recommended, so I kind of went for it. I did it in a also as a pour over, but in a Kalita, in a Kalita wave. I have to order my Marqaha Moments.
No, we'll get that to you. I'm going to do a little shameless self plug here, Elizabeth, if you don't mind.
I don't mind.
I do want to say that we're trying again to kind of honor culture in a number of different ways, and so this is our Ethiopian coffee, and we call it the source, right? Because like Abdul Rahman said, Ethiopia is the divinely ordained origin of coffee, right? And so this is called the source, and that's our single origin Ethiopian coffee. We do have that Java mocha that we mentioned that we're trying out right now.
It's delicious.
Thank you so much. And then we also have a Colombian, we have a Chiapas, and so if anybody's interested in these, you can just check out the website and help us meet these goals and and this opportunity that we have.
And Elizabeth, I know we're over time, but there was a question around sort of Italian coffee and espresso, and I think it's worth mentioning it. You know, coffee, the wondrous thing to me about coffee is to whichever culture it goes, it becomes beloved, and it also becomes an obsession. And because it becomes an obsession, we develop all kinds of new tools and technologies really around it in order to extract from it. And so really the emergence of our contemporary espresso machines happen in Europe, particularly in Italy and elsewhere, where the flavor, you know, the desire of the coffee is for that highly concentrated, full mouthfeel on the edge of, you know, bringing out the bitterness of the coffee. And therefore, you see this incredible innovation that happens in Italian coffee and in European coffee. And the adding of milk, of course, is something that goes back to the early coffee houses of Vienna, and then travels throughout Europe. And of course, Viennese coffee tradition and Italian coffee tradition now are unique. Scandinavian coffee tradition is unique because wherever coffee goes, it creates its own speciality. And of course, you know, here in the Americas, we have the incredible Cuban coffee where they mix sugar into the ground coffee and then put it into the espresso maker. And my God,
really bad for your espresso machine. But
my God, the first time I had that Cuban coffee where the sugars are caramelized literally into the coffee, it was incredible. And the most incredible espresso I had, I must say this, Abbas, because the person who extracts it doesn't extract it anymore. It was in Tokyo, and the type of espresso was called Angel Stain, and it was Master Tanaka at the small coffee shop in the heart of this kind of interesting artsy, you know, kind of community in Tokyo, and he basically spent years perfecting this one type of extraction where he would take the coffee, he would set up his espresso machine to a high degree of extraction, take it as high as the pressure would go, and then extract, but only extract out maybe 30 grams or 30 ml. And it was when it would sit at the bottom of the espresso, it was really like a stain at the bottom.
oh, I got you. So it was less
exactly.
Ristretto, huh?
Exactly, even less than a ristretto. And he called it the Angel Stain.
That's
and
amazing.
I had read about it, I had heard about it. He only pulls 20 a day. You got to get there at opening time, 11 o'clock, because it's gone within the first 20 minutes. People come. And I went and I got an Airbnb next to his coffee shop, and I slept in the first morning. And on the second morning, I was there at 10:45. I saw him working inside with his partner and wife. I get in there, I got my first Angel Stain. And I can honestly tell you, it was a God shot moment.
I got to figure out a way to come up with a research project.
You know what? It was like I had the coffee, and you know, like, you know, an espresso between its bitterness and its bite, right? You want that chocolatey bitterness without the bite, because if it bites, you know, it's like, oh, it's sour. This is the kind of coffee, man, that I had on my tongue, and I literally felt like a wave roll. And it got almost to the point where I said, oh, I'm going to bite. The sourness is coming. And it never came.
That's great.
It turned into brown sugar on my tongue.
Oh, that's amazing.
I was crying. And then I got a second, then I got a second one. I'm like, it couldn't happen twice in a row. Oh, and then I got the second one. I'm like, it happened again.
It's amazing. It was just there's a coffee in Kuwait and in Dubai and Saudi Arabia. It's a green bean extraction. It's about the size of a ristretto, but it's delicious. It's a very interesting coffee. It's not really on the market in the States at all. They make it similar to Turkish coffee, but you're really not supposed to ask for more than one. You know, it's a little bit rude, but I would really kill it. About espresso, real quick. I know that folks need to sign off, but about espresso and about how coffee travels, I'll say that if anybody's in New York City, anytime soon, if you're on the Eastern Seaboard and you spend some time in Manhattan, if you're ever between Washington Park and Greenwich Village, right in between, okay, just a few blocks off of Washington Park, there's a great cafe called Reggio's Cafe. It seems like, and it seems to be checked out, that it's the home of the first espresso machine, okay? But it's an amazing space, because if you talk about a Mediterranean cafe, they really have, I mean, it's absolutely amazing. They have artwork in there that should be in the Met. Literally like Caravaggio's students huge, huge, amazing paintings. They have the original espresso machine that they brought over. And when you're sitting down waiting for a table, because it's completely packed, there's a little bench to the side. That bench comes from the Medici family's portico, right? So it's absolutely an amazing space. Reggio's Cafe right in there, and you can experience a history of global, kind of experience a moment in global coffee history and what it symbolizes. Elizabeth, I'm sure that we got to get out soon, but and wrap up soon. But I just want to say that, for those who are watching in the Atlanta area or Georgia area, the museum's open, right? Like you can make
Museum is open. I was going to say, please come. We're now open to the public. You do have to make a reservation because we have limited capacity because of COVID. And you have to go online, make a reservation, and then you will get an email from Emory to fill out a health questionnaire. So please come and see this incredibly beautiful coffee pot and all of the pieces of the show that have to do with hospitality. And look closely, the two little cups that are with that pot, evidently one of them has half a poem and the other has half a poem, because there was this idea that coffee is such a social beverage. So we're open, Ebrik is open. You can have Wondrous Worlds coffee, the Marqaha Moments. You can buy it by the cup or by the bag at the museum, or you can buy it at the Ebrik website. So thank you both for being with us today. This was really great fun.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. It was great. Abdurrahman, it was great seeing you. Abdurrahman, we got to connect, okay? I got to get that book.
Yes, I need to take some pictures of the book for you. And thank you so much, Elizabeth. And
thank you
for giving us this amazing opportunity. Take care, everyone.
I know.